My name's Andrew Chunilall. I'm the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada. We're based out of Ottawa, but we are a pan-Canadian organization. And we work with community foundations all across the country. There are 191 place-based community foundations in Canada. It's a movement that is approaching 100 years in Canada. The very first community foundation was in Winnipeg, and it's one of our largest community foundations to date. Most community foundations are located in three provinces. Manitoba has the most, followed by Ontario and BC. We cover about 90% of the Canadian population in terms of place. The 10% that is unserved consists of mostly our northern communities, so in the territories and in the northern part of those western provinces, and also in northern Quebec. But we're actively pursuing opportunities to have those place-based community foundations in that part of the country. It's certainly a goal to serve all Canadians. I think our organization went through similar challenges as most others, whether they be in the corporate sector or in the charitable realm. And that is that liquidity became an issue. And then operating in an environment where the future was uncertain was also an issue. And we started to examine our cash flow requirements, our ability to do our work and deliver our outcomes in an environment that was effectively locked down. And so we were learning new habits. We were experimenting with technology and how our team could continue work when we're all in separate locations. And so although that was part of our dynamic before the pandemic, we are a team that is dispersed, have significant travel requirements. There was some getting used to. However, moving to it as an exclusive environment presented new challenges, but also new opportunities. The other thing is, and I have to give a lot of credit to government and corporate and individual donors across the country. Canadians and Canadian corporations and the Canadian government have been extremely generous in moving money into systems to keep organizations and those serving vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities operating effectively. And I think that was an important mechanism that showed up. That had it not happened, I think we would be in a much more difficult situation than we are in now. But there's still lots of work to do. We as you know, the number of new cases on a daily basis in Canada is dramatically lower now than it was at the peak. I think there was a point in time, I think it was in April, where as a country we were almost at 2,000 new cases a day. And today that number seems to be well under 500. So the safety protocols have worked or are working. And at the same time, we recognize that a vaccine is still a ways away and that we have to learn how to work and operate with new protocols, with new habits, and in the safest way possible. The Community Foundation Network is very diverse, and so the responses have varied across our country. I'm very proud and by the response of community foundations the leadership, and the donors. We've done a lot to move money into the nonprofit and charitable system. We've done it quickly, quicker than we've ever done it before. Community foundations are operating out of their normal granting cycles. They're requiring less documentation, less bureaucracy. They're supporting more operational, general operational efforts as opposed to specific project-oriented efforts. And this is all designed to keep the system propped up and to keep frontline agencies working and supporting those vulnerable communities. As we all know, when you shut the economy down in the way that we've had to, it's the people that were most vulnerable going in that will experience the disproportionate impacts of that. And so social service agencies, frontline workers, healthcare system, all of those systems are critically needed and needed more so for those populations. And our community foundations, along with government assistance through the Economic Emergency Community Support Fund, have been critical in supporting that need. I think it's difficult to make a determination on that because we're still in the process of collecting data. Notionally, and we'll know this, months later. Notionally, I feel that as a whole, philanthropy has really stepped up. There was a call to action from communities, from agencies, and I think philanthropy as a whole, including community foundations, heard that call and have made every effort possible to increase distributions, to bring other donors to the table, to speed up giving. I feel as though that's happening, that the numbers will demonstrate that, and we'll be able to prove that, I think, down the road when the data comes in. Canada is an extremely large country geographically, and I think it's always a challenge to understand what's happening in the different communities. Rural Canada will experience the pandemic differently than urban Canada. We know that, and then the North has its own completely different dimension, but also culture matters too. How people live, how they socialize, how they work, which industries are driving different parts of the economy all matter. And that just the differences that play out and what type of requirements are needed in the province of Alberta versus where you are in Quebec are radically different. And so I think what's been important and what's been needed is on the ground intelligence, knowledge, and very specific data on a particular community so that we can understand where to pinpoint with precision where the requirements are needed, and to understand the cultural context through which the requirements or the funding is being provided. And there's very few places on earth where that's more difficult than Canada. As you know, our country is built on this deep appreciation for multiculturalism, and just with the proliferation of immigration in the past 40, 50 years, the racial inequalities that we see playing out in the background right now, cultural context is critically important. But this is where community foundations are key, because their leadership, their governance, their processes are embedded in very local and specific culture. And then when we can deliver highly precisioned and specific supports, it makes all the difference with that context. A one-size-fits-all approach has never been a satisfactory outcome for Canada. And so when we deploy, as an example, the resources through the Emergency Community Support Fund, It's through community foundations. And that's why we are such an important partner, along with the United Way and Canadian Red Cross, with the federal government in that initiative, because they value that local knowledge, local expertise, and an appreciation that those institutions in those communities understand the community's needs best and how they differentiate regionally. I think there was a phrase that we're learning so many new things, new ways of working during the pandemic, but the one phrase that we sort of embedded in our working environment was speed over recovery, speed over perfection. And if you just take your mindset back to the latter part of March, early April, it was a highly uncertain environment, tremendous amount of anxiety, stress, and fear about the future. But we knew we had to act, and we didn't have time to get it all perfect. And we also have to trust the relationships and the institutions that we've been working with for almost 100 years in this country. And that starts with government all the way down to that very local, small grassroots organization that's delivering support. And I think everybody is an important part of that value chain in ensuring and protecting Canadians. We have a strong social safety net in this country. It's something that we're recognized for around the globe. But even that social safety net isn't perfect and wasn't designed with a global pandemic in mind. And so we've seen how the healthcare system has responded. And in part, there were certain trade-offs there. We're now seeing that because we had to divert capacity into COVID-19 measures, people who may have caught cancer earlier on or had a preventative health issue that would have been detected and dealt with, we're now seeing the impacts of that show up, and we'll continue to see that through the fall. We're seeing it in the education system, but we're also going to see that in philanthropy, because we've redirected resources from certain areas to deal with a very acute, specific, and urgent matter. But those other areas still required support. It was the right thing to do. We don't live in a world where resources are unlimited, but we also have to be prepared for these concurrent waves and how they will show up in the social fabric of Canada. I might think of it as a frame as opposed to a mechanism. What we're hearing, there was an ECOS survey done maybe about a couple of months ago, and in that survey, a significant amount of Canadians, I think more than 3/4 of Canadians surveyed, feel as though we need transformational change in this country. And transformation is a strong word. I think there's a lot of young Canadians, vulnerable Canadians, that expect our systems to undergo radical change to support the recovery and a build back that's more future oriented. Very few people that I've met want to rebound to where we were before, even before the pandemic. And I think the pandemic gives us some permission and license as leaders to consider what that robust change looks like. We've looked at the, it's always, I like history. And I was reading some interesting materials in the post-World War II environment. And at least in the case of Great Britain at the time, they were in really tough times, and they were trying to rebuild that country after the war, as many others were. And there was an economist by the name of William Beveridge. He issued the Beveridge Report, and that was a framework and an architecture for a recovery. And within that report, there were things, just crazy notions, like universal health care, like a countrywide pension system, like equitable access to education for all. And these were the key pillars for a social safety net that then the Commonwealth embraced, but then also form an important part of the Canadian fabric today. I find that we're likely in a similar situation, and that we'll have to pen a new architecture for recovery. I think things like a universal basic income, which have been on the agenda for some time, but hasn't really taken hold. I think those things will be looked at more carefully and closely. I think, I envision that there will be some derivation of that in play for Canadians. But then I also think, well, what does that mean for philanthropy? If we have a social safety net that notionally takes care of the basic needs of people, so, basic food, water, shelter, security, then what's the role of philanthropy in an environment that has that? And so how do we rethink ourselves? Because we ourselves as philanthropists or as leaders in philanthropy are part of this overarching system. I think about, that Minister Morneau grabbed a lot of attention last week because of the size of the deficit, which is significant. We've never seen a deficit this large outside of wartime. And then, and of course, the growing debt. Government will have levers within a recovery, and they'll have to look at the taxation system. I can't imagine that they're going to be taxing corporations at a high level, because they'll need corporations to invest and employ, and they'll need them to stimulate the economy. I think individual taxation will go up to support what we're doing now. But in addition to that, it won't be enough. It won't be enough to bridge the gap. And I think that's where philanthropy really has to step up. Our endowments become a critical part of that. So to your point, the mechanism, I think the endowment mechanism is one that will probably undergo some change and innovation. We've typically, our business models are build endowments, attract endowments, invest them in the capital markets to earn a return, and then our distributions are around 5, 6, 7%. But what about the other 95% or the 93%? And I think in a build back frame and a recovery frame, we'll have to be creative about ensuring how that other 93 to 95% is deployed and part of the recovery and the build back. This is the unknown territory we're in right now. And I think there's a senator who brought a recommendation forward that the Canadian government should think about bringing some derivation of the universal basic income in. In Manitoba, a number of years ago, they experimented in Dauphin with universal basic income, and that's been written up and talked about and studied. And I think the outcomes were overall positive. But that was contemplating a UBI without any notion of a global pandemic. Now we have that in place, and so the external conditions matter. I think philanthropy has to rethink itself in the context of the pandemic and other frames. Another one that I'll bring in is capitalism. We are a creation of capitalism. The very early philanthropists that we have, what we study, could be Andrew Carnegie or Ford or Rockefeller. These were capitalists and industrialists that generated a tremendous amount of wealth and prosperity, power and influence. And then they created foundations. They created really modern day philanthropy. But if they weren't so successful at creating a tremendous amount of wealth, they probably wouldn't have been philanthropists in the same way that they were. And so we have to recognize the duality that capitalism plays out in philanthropy. And one, it's responsibility in creating philanthropy, but also capitalism's responsibility in creating the inequities that philanthropy perpetuates. And so that's the duality, that's the tension. And so we have to have a conversation about how do we rethink capitalism such that we can still create wealth. Obviously, that's an important part of capitalism. We should embrace that because wealth is an empowering thing. But we can't have it creating wealth in an inequitable way. And we've seen all the numbers. We know that what proportion of the world holds what proportion of the wealth, and that's just not sustainable. There is enough wealth out there for all of us, but we need to figure out ways where that wealth can do more good for more people. I think most of the change, Christophe, is actually coming from a shifting donor sentiment. Younger people have a very strong connection to social justice issues, a very strong connection to a green recovery, an equitable society, and an inclusive economy where everybody can participate, more so than what I learned in school, or that my parents learned. And I think that sentiment will ultimately change everything: government, philanthropy, and the corporate point of view. I'll draw your attention to last August, almost 12 months ago, the Business Roundtable in the United States, which consists of, I believe, 160 plus CEOs of the largest multinational corporations in the world, issued a letter challenging the shareholder primacy notion. So like when I went to business school, I was taught that corporations have one purpose, and that is to create wealth for shareholders. And that's just a fundamental notion. That's right from Milton Friedman. And then you have the most powerful CEOs saying, actually, that's not going to work anymore. What we need to do is think about stakeholders, which means we have to value not only opinions of our shareholders, but of our employees, of our suppliers, of our customers, of the communities and the environment in which we do business. That's the new way forward. And that's coming from the business world. And so I still think we're behind in philanthropy. I still think we do privilege certain voices. We do privilege the voices of those that hold the most wealth because we need them. We need them to build endowments and to make contributions. But when we do so, we privilege and orient our culture around a very small group of people. And it's actually the group of people we don't effectively serve when we think about going into communities and those most vulnerable. I think there's awareness and connecting dots and conversations, and the world's changing so quickly. I hear this from many people, not just from myself, but I think people want to know and understand how the systems are working and what they can do to advance change in a very meaningful and thoughtful way for community. And they're reliant upon philanthropic leaders to do that. And so I think we just need to be more vocal. We need to be more articulate. We need to be more courageous in suggesting what might seem like bold ideas, but are actually the ideas that are required for more healthy communities in our country. I still think we're trying to figure that out. We are the purpose that we get behind as a movement is about building a Canada where every Canadian feels like they belong to this country. And the demographic story has been told many times. We're a country of 36 million people. We're an aged country. And, I don't think we've ever had this number of people in our population or the proportion over the age of 55 higher than it is now. and our birth rate's extremely low. Our birth rate is 1.7. The replacement rate is 2.1. And when you think about that, and life expectancy is about 80 for both men and women, we're an aged country, and we're heavily reliant on immigration. And in fact, if there is a part of the country that has a high birth rate, it's the Indigenous population. It's almost 5, I believe. So you just play this out, and the Canada that we are going to encounter in the next 20 years will visibly just be radically different. And we know just by the racial tension that's playing out in the United States and Canada, all across the world probably, that visible identification has an impact on belonging. It has an impact on how we relate to other people, our biases, our judgments, our misconceptions about those folks. And so we need new skill sets. We need new capacities when we step into this highly multicultural frame. And there's what I call cultural intelligence. I think this is the thing. This is the thing that's required to be effective in a future Canada. And we joked earlier on. You were going to have a challenge speaking English, and I was going to have a challenge speaking French. And I think those things, have always been there, but they're proliferating so quickly. And very few countries are dealing with it well. I think cultural capacity and an ability to understand people through their identity and their relationship to place will be more important in the future than it's ever been. And that's something that Community Foundations of Canada and community foundations are taking quite seriously. Our knowledge of community really matters. And as a matter of history and structure, governments are centralized. It's just the way that it is. And governments will always require partners so that they can help understand what's actually happening in the community. And I think philanthropy has a key role in being a partner to government to help deploy resources in the very specific areas that it needs to be. I also think that, with the what I referred to before, which is the business roundtable, recognizing that corporations are now finding a new way into working with communities because they see that communities are a critical stakeholder, that they themselves are also centralized to a degree. And their orientation to community is through a customer orientation or an employee orientation. But they need community philanthropy to offer up an additional point of view and perspective. And so that's also valued. So I think we have to make ourselves available as tri-sector partners so that we can work cohesively with government and corporations and others within the sector to maximize the resources that we have. I would add that I don't think we should get stronger at the expense of anybody else. I don't think this is about moving power away from other sectors or other institutions towards our own. It's about trying to find ways where all of us can be elevated because the system will be stronger if we're all stronger. And I think oftentimes we find ourselves trying to acquire power or wealth or capital at the expense of others. And I think this is about redistribution, and this is about recovery, and this is about rebuild. The one important frame that my colleague Andrea Dix and I talk about often is this idea of thinking about the way that we lead through a network frame as opposed to an institutional frame. So I could be the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada and act in the best interests of the institution that employs me every day. And in doing so, I can build a really strong, robust institution. But if we're too narrow in our point of view, I can build that really strong institution at the expense of other institutions or at the expense of others. So they become weaker as we get stronger. And I think if we approach our problems as a set of complex systems and networks, we think about the problem that way. So sometimes doing what's right for a community may not be in the best interest of my institution, but I need permission. I need permission to operate that way. And I think this is where boards of directors are important. I think they have to give permission to their leaders to do what's in the best interest of the purpose that you're serving, which may not immediately be in the best interest of your organization or your institution. And I think if we can all think that way, ultimately that yields better impacts for communities, and it'll yield better impacts for institutions too over the long term. I think all the examples you pointed out point to the need for ongoing conversation and staying connected. We have to understand the key intervention points within any system. Where do we get the most, which interventions give us the best bang for our buck? And in looking at any societal issue, it's very complex, has many different angles. But if we understand that problem holistically, we can figure out what are the key levers that we need to pull. And that requires, to your suggestion, many conversations transsectorally, which means don't just speak to people that are closest to you, speak to people that are farthest away. Bring your corporate partners to the table. Bring the different levels of government to the table. Bring people that can offer an equality lens, an inclusive lens, a climate recovery lens, an indigenous lens. You want all of those people at the table so that you can approach the system holistically and then discover which intervention points are the ones that you want to pull on. I think, I'm 45 years old and I was born and raised in Canada. And I've never seen the Prime Minister on TV every morning for months on end, weeks on end. And so I think we're building new habits. And so I have to tip my hat to Canadians as a whole, because as I started off with, we were almost 2,000 cases a day in April. And today we're less than 500 new cases a day. And we've had tremendous success because we valued the health and well-being of society over our individual needs. And so we see people walking around with masks. We see businesses opening up with all the personal protective equipment in place. We see that there's a deeper appreciation for one another. And we also recognize that in doing so, we're making personal sacrifices. But the data bornes out the success. We have brought the curve down in a considerable way. And I think, we don't have to look far to understand how it could have played out had we made different choices. And I'm not saying it was easy. I'm not saying that there wasn't pain and suffering along the way, or that we won't experience more of that in the future. But it really causes me to be proud and grateful to be a Canadian in the way that we have created a safe country through all of this by the personal sacrifice in respect of the collective good of society. I think we're building new muscle memory. I think things that weren't weren't common 4 or 5 months ago are now become habituated into our individual organizational memory, and I think that's a good thing. I think we're going to hopefully become a safer country. I think we're going to embrace a more inclusive economy in the recovery. I think we're going to have more gender equality, more racial equity, and I think we'll continue on this journey of reconciliation with our Indigenous communities and continue to make progress. I think that's Canada. I think as a country, that is our, of all the things that we do well, I think that's our brand. And I think Canadians take that with a great deal of pride, and I think they'll use that as our North Star and our aspiration to do better going forward.